Okay, we're going to get started. Can everyone hear me? Great. So today is April 10th, 2018. It's 11 a.m., and this is panel 2103, Earth in Human Hands. Welcome, everybody. So my name is Cassandra Brooks. I'm an assistant professor here at CU Boulder in environmental studies. I very much work at the intersection of science, policy, and the public. I've spent the last 15 years working in Antarctica, and I'm very interested in questions of how we conserve global commons, so areas that belong to the whole world, like Antarctica. So I'm very excited to moderate this panel on this idea of Earth in human hands. Before I introduce, I would like to just state, before we get started, we would like to mention that this session is underwritten by the CU Environmental Center, which is helping us to reduce the Conference on World Affairs Environmental Impact. The center's support has enabled the CWA to purchase carbon offsets for speaker airline travel, to reduce its paper consumption by creating our app, to promote our live streaming platform, and to offer free hop bus service. We encourage you to make use of these resources during your time here. Okay, so I'm going to introduce each of our panelists. Next to me is David Grinspoon. He is an astrobiologist and an award-winning author based in Washington, D.C. He's a senior scientist at the Planetary Science Institute, and his work focuses on the evolution of Earth-like planets and potential conditions for life elsewhere in the universe. This panel is actually titled after his book. Would you like to hold it up, David? His book that came out in 2016. And he actually wrote the book when he was the first chair of astrobiology at the Library of Congress in D.C. That gave him the opportunity to take the time to write this book. David does not only explore astrobiology in his free time, which I can't imagine there's much of. He is an award-winning musician. He currently performs with the House Band of the Universe. He plays guitar. He didn't bring his guitar here today, but there are guitars in Boulder, so hopefully we will hear him play at some point. Next to David is Tracy Holloway. She's a professor in the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies and Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She leads air quality research, really seeking to understand the links between regional air quality, energy, health, and the climate. She founded the Earth Science Women's Network in 2002. She was one of only 5 women to found that, and now, as of 2017, there's 3,000 members in that group. I know, right? She is also a big fan of The Bachelor and Bachelorette in her free time, so. Next to Tracy is Jennifer Thompson. She's an assistant professor in the Parks, Tourism, and Recreation Management program at the University of Montana. Her work focuses on large landscape conservation, sustainable tourism, protected areas, and links between human and ecological health. And her work and education takes her all over the world. And incredibly, not on her international travels, but in a lot of her national travels, she does take her dog named Pup, who's actually 13 years old. And he loves being outside as much as she does. Okay, and finally, Alexander Verbeek. He's a Dutch diplomat and former strategic policy advisor of the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has spent almost 30 years working on international security, humanitarian, and geopolitical risk issues, and how all this links to the Earth's accelerating environmental crisis. He's led a variety of initiatives. I don't have time to talk about all of them, but a lot regarding climate change and security relationships. He formed the Planetary Security Initiative, and also, if you want to follow climate change issues on Twitter, he is your guy. He currently has 155,000 followers on Twitter, so I'm hoping after this he'll have about 200,000. So follow Alexander. Okay, so we will be using the CWA app. Has everyone got that app on their phone? Basically, if you want to submit questions to the panel, please do so through the app. If you don't have the app or you don't want to use the app, the producers will have note cards that you can write questions on as well, and they'll bring those up to me. But on the app, you basically would just search for this panel, and you can submit a question, which I will be able to see. So if you're a student, please note this in your question, and please make your questions brief and to the points. Okay. So I would like to give each of the panelists 5 to 6 minutes to make opening remarks, and then I'll give them a chance to respond to each other, but we'll just go down the line, starting with you, David. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. When I saw that the title of this panel was Earth in Human Hands, I thought, wow, what a coincidence. That's the name of my book. And I thought this must be exactly how Herman Melville felt if he was asked to be on a panel called Moby Dick. So I don't know if they had panels back then. But anyways, my book isn't quite as long as Moby Dick, but it's hefty. And I'm going to take 5 minutes now and just tell you a few of what I think are some of the a few key points that then will maybe spur discussion. I am an astrobiologist by training, meaning I study other planets and I do climate modeling of other planets using the same models we use to model Earth. And I've dabbled in Earth models, but I mostly do Venus, Mars, other planets, trying to understand their evolution, how they compare to Earth, with a particular eye on the question of habitability. Where are there good habitats for life elsewhere in the universe? And this has made me keenly aware of the interesting and complex relationship between biological evolution and planetary evolution. And it's interesting then to apply that insight back to Earth and look at the long and convoluted history of our planet and the relationship between the biosphere and the rest of the planet. And the major transformations that relationship has undergone, and then try to look at our time, this very challenging time when we human beings find ourselves, whether we like it or not, playing this unusual, maybe sort of frightening role in changing this planet, and trying to come to grips with that, and looking at that question from the perspective of an astrobiologist who thinks about large-scale changes in planetary evolution. That was what I went to the Library of Congress for, and that was ultimately what I produced in this book, Earth in Human Hands, was a look at our time, which people have called the Anthropocene, the time when humans have become a major geological force, whether we like it or not. It's pretty undeniable that we have become one. And look at that transition from the lens of astrobiology. And it's another way of looking at the question of what are we? What are we doing here on this planet? What is really new and different about this time, this challenging time, this Anthropocene, from the planet's perspective, from a planetary evolution perspective? And when you look at it that way, you realize, well, Earth has been through some radical changes over its long history. And life has been involved in several of these changes. In fact, when you try to ask what's new about us, about this transition, you quickly learn that we are not the first species, not the first life form to come along and radically change the planet. That's been done before. We're not the first life form to come along and sort of wreck the planet for other life. That's been done. But there is something undeniably new about what's going on here. And one way to look at it is that we're the first planet changers, planet wreckers, possibly, to know that we're doing it. We are the first geological force to be aware of its own existence. And that is a radical change. So I talk about cognitive forces becoming planetary forces, and how in the whole long history of our planet and our biosphere and all the changes we've been through, that's never been the case. And it's a very strange thing to be a geological force, becoming aware that you are a geological force. And what are the implications of that? For one thing, it's very frightening. This term, the Anthropocene, has been criticized. Well, who are we to name a geological age after ourselves? Isn't that arrogant? In a way, it is, but it's also honest. In a way, it's overcoming the denial of wishing that it weren't so. The evidence is incontrovertible, not just climate, but so many other ways. We are changing the planet with a greater force than the long-standing other forces of geological change, tectonism and volcanism and natural sources of climate change. We have become a player on the planet at that scale, and we have to acknowledge that and then figure out how to deal with ourselves with that knowledge. So that's why I actually like the term Anthropocene. because I feel like it's an overcoming a certain denial, although I understand why people are, it is frightening and upsetting, to realize that. Then what do we do with that knowledge? In my view, we don't have the option to not be planet changers. It would be great if we did, but certainly not maintaining a population of many billions of people. We don't. You could advocate for a radical decrease in those numbers. That has certain challenging logistical implications as well, shall we say. But I also think there's a certain promise in this realization, this awakening to our role. We could be at an early stage of that. We obviously haven't done a very good job of being cognitive, a cognitive geological force so far, but there's potential there in this potential awakening to this fact. We could be the first species ever to decide not to cause a mass extinction. We wouldn't be, if we cause a mass extinction, which we haven't done yet, but we're on a path to doing that if we don't change our ways. It would not be the first mass extinction. If we avoid mass extinction, which we can do, it would be the first time that any force of nature had said, hey, let's change our minds and not cause a mass extinction. We tend to romanticize so-called primitive humans, although that's obviously an awful term, but think that, before we had our modern world with all of its complications, humans were so much better and life was so much better. Well, actually, humans have a long history of causing extinction. Ever since we left Africa and spread around the world, we wiped out the large animals in every continent. It's what we've always done. If we change that, we could also be the first humans to not follow that pattern. So I want to stop here and hear what my fellow panelists have to say, but I guess my main point is that by realizing what we are a force of change on the planet. We are the first time cognitive processes have become planetary processes. That's a very fraught position to be in, and we don't really know how to handle ourselves very well in that situation. But the first step is realizing the truth of your situation, and as we come to awaken to that fact, there's potential to use that knowledge to change the way we operate on this planet and to create a more sustainable future for ourselves and the rest of the biosphere.
Well, hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here, and this is an exciting panel.
Closer to the microphone.
To take part.
Sorry.
Yeah, this is an exciting panel to take part in. When I first heard of the title for this panel, the first thought that came to my mind was, first, what are they talking about? Earth in human hands? Whose hands? Why the title? And then last night at dinner, I met David, and I figured it out. The key was unlocked. But I also discovered a few other things last night at dinner. One, we discovered we went to the same undergraduate institution. I also discovered we're both computer modelers. And I also discovered we both came at the problem of environmental change from kind of a similar planetary perspective. In my case, I was an undergraduate major in applied math, and I was very worried about getting a job after graduation, as many students are. And so during the summer before my senior year of undergraduate, I applied to every internship I could find. I applied to the FBI, to the Northern Trust Bank of Chicago, to the New York State Prosecutor's Office. I applied to NASA. And of all those places, actually the NASA Johnson Space Flight Center accepted me through a program at the Lunar and Planetary Institute. And I received a phone call from the internship coordinator, and he said, well, there's two projects that we think you'd be a good fit for. So the question is, which planet do you prefer? Earth or Venus? You know? And I really thought about this, and I thought, well, I know more about Earth, and I live on Earth, so maybe I'll choose Earth. And that really set my work moving forward. And I started learning about what's going on Earth from a planetary perspective. and got interested in the atmosphere as something that really affects humans on the Earth to a remarkable degree. What you wore this morning was really determined by what's going on in the atmosphere. The air that you're breathing is determined by what's going on in the atmosphere. The plants that are growing, the flowers that are blooming, the birds in the sky, all of those things are determined by the atmosphere that we're living in. And as I moved through my career and through graduate school even in particular, I realized that it wasn't just what was happening at the planetary scale. It was what's happening in the air and the environment that we're each living in on a day-to-day basis. And that those things are changing on a local scale due to factors on a local scale that are interacting with the globe. So a lot of my work over the past years has been really looking at the interplay between decisions and change happening on the local scale and decisions and change that are happening on the global scale. And here is where I think we come back to the Earth in Human Hands theme of this conversation, because when we start thinking about whose hands are we talking about, it starts getting very complicated. Oftentimes what's good for one group is not good for someone else. Often what's good for today is not good for tomorrow. And often the solutions that may be a win in terms of one aspect of our planet's health may be a lose in terms of another aspect of the planet's health. And I'll just give a concrete example from the work that I do in terms of air quality. When we think of air quality, there are chemicals in the air that have direct negative impacts on human health. They shorten life expectancy, they increase the odds that you'll check into the hospital with an asthma attack, they increase the odds that an organ transplant won't work. It cuts across everything. These same chemicals degrade crop yields, they degrade rubber, they impact visibility. There's a mix of different chemicals we're talking about, but they all have one big characteristic, which is that they react in the atmosphere. They react with your lungs, they react with the leaves, they react with each other, and anything that reacts in the atmosphere doesn't hang around for very long. If it's reactive, then it cannot just hang around forever. It reacts and forms something new. So these reactive gases and particles pose direct, immediate impacts on the now, on a lot of things we care about as a society. And the good news is these are things that we can change. There's a lot of technologies out there to make cars cleaner, power plants more, the waste streams less polluting, and cook stoves cleaner for rural communities around the world. So as an optimist, I'm not just a Bachelorette watcher, I also am an optimist, and I believe in the future. And actually, air quality is a great environmental field for an optimist to be working in. In the United States, our air is getting cleaner and cleaner and cleaner. There are proven technologies to make pretty much any energy source have fewer reactive pollutants coming out of the tailpipe or the waste stream. But then we get to the problem of climate change, which I'm sure a lot of you we're going to be discussing over this panel, and I'm sure a lot of you have thought quite a bit about. And the gases that are most important for climate change are actually not reactive. That's why carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for 100 years or more, because it's not reacting with other chemicals. And when you have a gas that is in the atmosphere, floating around, warming the planet, then the time scales that we're talking about are different. It's not just hours to days, it's decades to centuries. It's not just what's happening here in Boulder and the Colorado Department of Public Health and the Environment. It is what's happening on a global basis and needs global solutions. And it's also a much more vexing problem, because it means that we may be changing systems that we wouldn't change otherwise. So just this question of what problems we're dealing with, who's making the solutions, and what are the trade-offs, this is one of the things that I think is most challenging when we think about the planet in human hands, that there isn't always a clear solution, and figuring out how in a democratic and a multinational context to solve the problems is really a challenge.
All right. Well, I love that I'm third in line because I think we've had a great foundation with different perspectives at different scales about how this topic, comes into play. And I'm going to be coming at it from a little bit of a different perspective of building off of what the previous speakers have touched on. And then I'm going to be focusing more on the human dimension, social science aspects of this. So, and I think some of the questions you raised, Tracy, about whose hands and how are these hands going to work and who's the winner and who's the loser are definitely some of the questions I was thinking about with this panel. And so I'm going to frame my thoughts into 6 different points, but I'm going to be talking about them as opportunities, but then also what are my concerns or some of the challenges I see with some of these aspects and how it comes into play with Earth in human hands. So the first point is that I think we are really an opportunity in that we are living in a time where we have more information, data, technology than probably we ever had before. And understanding, what was our climate like, back in what we consider the natural, stage? How do we restore these environments back to a previous, point? What are the strategies we can implement? And a lot of this is at our fingertips, and it's really, really exciting. I know for a scientist, for engineers, for all sorts of different disciplines. But it also brings up a lot of kind of ethical, moral challenges as well. I have a colleague who is an environmental philosopher, and he just came out with a book talking about the synthetic age in the Anthropocene that you were talking about, and how the way that we're dealing with this stage is we're kind of at a crossroads. How much genetics, technology, all these things are we going to have a heavy hand at play in, and is that right for us to intervene in a lot of these issues? Or is it best to let ride things out in a more natural way? And how are humans coming into this? And where do we set the baseline for what's natural and what to restore? And so I think there's a lot of concepts that we're trying to figure out with this concept of rewilding our places. And I think this is touched on in a lot of different themes in the conference this week. But there's a lot of opportunities there. How do we bring back species that were once extinct in certain areas? We have the means to do that. But what are the implications of that for the landscape that people are now living in there? What are the implications of that for the genetic diversity of this species? So just, some interesting questions for us to think about. A second point is that I really believe that we're in a time where we have a very, very environmentally conscious community, citizens, society. I think people are really concerned about a lot of these aspects. Sustainability has kind of become a norm in a lot of our conversations, and I see that as a really big positive aspect of where we can go in the future and address a lot of our challenges. However, we are also faced with the challenges of being in a time where we have such high levels of consumption, such high dependence on natural resources that are surpassing what we can actually provide. We have countries like India and China that have a rising middle class and, are having a much more greater demand on a lot of these resources than maybe they traditionally used to. And again, a lot of ethical factors come into play. How do we control those resources? Who has access? Who are the winners and losers that come into play with those dynamics? A third point is that I think we have access to places that we never used to think we could have access to. And I was really excited to talk to Cassandra before this panel started in her work with Antarctica. It used to be Antarctica is this exotic last wilderness. Well, now it's one of the fastest growing places for tourism probably on our planet, which is pretty exciting in a lot of ways. I mean, how many of us would like to go to Antarctica? I would, okay? But it also means a lot of implications environmentally down there, but also from a governance standpoint. When we think about common pool resources, how do we actually govern these places in a way that is going to sustain them for the future and meet a lot of social needs, but also recognizing that people want to access these places? Do they have the right to access these places? My fourth point, coming from my work with outdoor recreation and protected area management, is that we have a high amount of use, especially in the U.S., but I think worldwide, with the amount of people that want to access and utilize our public lands, whether it's a national park, national forest, state park, that people are wanting to utilize these places, and we really feel like they are a part of our identity, where you see a lot of these terms of keep public lands in public hands, which is really exciting that there's a lot of momentum there, a lot of people connecting to places, and hopefully then that transferring to them wanting to be stewards and supporting these places. However, we're also faced with challenges of limitations. We're seeing a lot of our public lands being loved to death. I'm sure you guys have heard that here in Colorado, right? You know, there's so much love and so much want to access these places that it's almost degrading not only these resources, but also the experience that a lot of us look for when we go to these places. So how do we put limits on that? And so that it's in a sustainable way, but also still providing access to the places we love and feel that we have a right to access and recreate on. And I'll speed through my last 2 points. The next point is the recognition of this connection between human health and ecosystem services. This is not something new. I think we have had a long connection between this relationship that our health is dependent on the health of our natural environment. I think we're seeing this in a lot of campaigns with Healthy Parks, Healthy People, prescription trails and parks. So this is very much a growing movement. But again, how do we balance human needs with social needs, especially in developing countries? Do we put forth, how do we balance conservation and preservation with also utilization of these resources for people that depend on them for their everyday lives? And then lastly, which is more of something that I think a lot of us are faced with in our field, comes to funding and grants. A lot of us, whether you're a researcher or a manager on the ground, doing all sorts of work, we're dependent on funding. And oftentimes, unfortunately, while there's a lot of funding and grant and programs out there to support a lot of these initiatives, which is really exciting and a great opportunity, they're not always on the same time frame as the amount of the work and the long-term work that needs to take place for us to do what we need to do, especially at the scales you guys are talking about. So I think it's really about telling that story and emphasizing the importance of this long-term game. And sometimes there's a disconnect between how decisions are made in Washington, D.C., and then how researchers and a lot of us are gathering data to really inform those decisions. So hopefully, I'm optimistic that in the future we can start bridging those gaps. So with that, I'm already over a minute, so I apologize, but I'm really excited to discuss and hear what the rest of our panel has to say on these topics.
Thank you. If you search in the Guinness Book of Records for the loneliest tree in the world, it will tell you about an island somewhere 400 kilometers south of New Zealand, which is called Campbell Island. And there's just one tree. And that one tree is relevant when you talk about the Anthropocene, because when researchers needed proof of the golden spike, the moment that all over the planet there was a noticeable rise in some change all over the planet that you could mark as the beginning of the Anthropocene, they looked for the proof that we did nuclear testing above ground, and that spiked in 1965. And that's easy to find, this golden spike, on the northern hemisphere in all kinds of places. But you needed it also on a place far away from where humans ever came. And so they went to this tree and they found it there. So, and that says that the Anthropocene started somewhere in October or November 1965, and I thought that was fantastic because I have lived 2 months of my life in the Holocene. I mean, who can say that? That's really a wonderful thing to know. But if that is really the thing we should think about as starting off the Anthropocenes, maybe in the far future, if we know that we've been wiped out by a nuclear worldwide destruction, then yeah, that would have been the right marker. Is it climate change that's going to be our biggest threat? Then you should maybe look at when we left with the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, the kind of safe zone that we used to be in the past 800,000 or the past few million years. And that is normally the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, somewhere between, let's say, 180 and 280 for the past million years. That is not like a constant climate. We had 4 massive ice ages, but that was the kind of natural fluctuation that climate deniers love to remind us of. But it's a bit earlier that if you take that market, that we left that kind of safe zone, they end up at about end of Second World War, maybe 1950. So when I was born, we were already far above that 280 or 300 mark. We were already at 319. Now we are at, where are we, 408? Who knows, who's the expert here on this? 408 more or less, depends where you measure and at what time. It's rapidly increasing with some 2 points per year. So the debate, when did the Anthropocene really start, on what day, is of course a bit silly, because you don't do that with geological eras. And I think that's an indication that for us it's so difficult as humans to really think on that long scale. When David was just mentioning that we were so good at wiping out the big animals in the world, if you look at when that started, the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. And if you would chop that in 100,000 little pieces, only that last 100th part of the history of the planet, then you are 46,000 years back. And that is when we had left Africa. And the first thing we did was walk all the way to Australia. And the next thing we did when we arrived in Australia was immediately wipe out these big animals we had there. It just took a few thousand years. And then went to the rest of the world, did the same thing again. We forgot about the oceans, but we're taking care of that right now. Horribly sad. I won't mention here the countries that are still doing whaling. It would not be nice for Norway and Japan and some others. The time scale that what we think on, this long time scale, that is so difficult for us. I'm a policymaker. Normally, in my normal life, I am. We make policies for the next few years. We try to look further ahead. When people really talk about the really, really long looking forward, we mention maybe the year 2100. That's just 82 years from now. It's just one lifetime. That is the long prediction. So take something like sea level rise. The NOAA predictions that came out in I think, the famous January 2016, they say that in the bad case scenario, and that's where we often end up, that at the end of this century, it can be something like 2 meters or 7 feet, I think. Nobody ever talks about the other prediction that they make about the year 2200, when it's close to 10 meters, some 30 feet. And people think that somewhere magically, all problems stop at 2100. If you go back those 82 years, you're in 1936. My father was already a boy of 10 years old. He would meet my mother 10 years later. I mean, 82 years is not that far, and certainly not on a geological scale. I'm trying to see what I can say in the little time that I have. So we are now in the Anthropocene. We see everywhere we see the wildfires in California. We see the rapid melting of the Arctic. We see the extreme weather everywhere. Just to mention one thing to visualize it, and there I'll stop because then I've reached already your 7 minutes. But look at Greenland, the melting of ice of Greenland. If you would like to offset here with the community in Boulder, the melting of the ice of Greenland, that takes place in one day, and you would just like to make a huge ice cube that you keep here on a central square somewhere for one day of melting in Greenland, you would need the highest building in Denver, which is like 200 meters high. You put 5 of them on top of each other, and a kilometer away you make another one, and then 2 more, and then you build a wall, a huge wall between those 4 towers, and then you start filling it up with ice cubes. And you do that every day. That is how you offset the melting only of Greenland. I'm not even talking about West Arctic ice shelves and East Arctic ice shelves, the studies that came out in 2014, 2015 that say that they were like irreparably damaged, even if it would get colder. Okay, I still got 5 seconds. I'll stop there. Thanks.
So before we go to questions, I'd just like to give each of the panelists a few minutes to respond to any of the, so many ideas were brought up across the panel. So David, we could start with you.
Yeah, just one thought, and I really appreciate all of your comments. It's so interesting to me how just this one phrase can generate so many different but related thoughts on this question of what do we do about the fact that Earth is in some sense in human hands. And one thing that a couple people touched on, sort of the first thing that Tracy mentioned was this dichotomy between local and global effects, and therefore needs, the difference in scale between our actions on a daily basis and then our need to be aware of the global effects of that. Excuse me. And one critique that often is made in response to the concept of the Anthropocene. I mean, the Anthropocene it's a fruitful concept, partly because a lot of people really don't like it. It generates arguments and discussions, and therefore I think it's worthwhile, because these arguments and discussions are on the topics we need to be talking about. What's our role on this planet? How do we deal with it? But one critique that's often made is that it's too much of a species narrative, that when we say earth in human hands and we say we need to do this, or we did this and now we need to do that, what we are we talking about? And when we just use that we that means global humanity, aren't we glossing over a lot of important questions of environmental justice and so forth? I mean, it's not we, all of humanity, that got us into this mess, and it's not we, all of humanity, that's going to suffer the most at first. There's a big dichotomy between the rich industrialized nations who've put most of the carbon in the atmosphere and the vulnerable poor nations, and many of which in low-lying areas that are, going to bear the brunt at first. So isn't it irresponsible, therefore, to talk about this species narrative? And that's a critique that that I've thought about a lot, and I think it's valid, but I don't think, I think the answer is kind of complex. If you step back, as I like to do, and look at the history of the planet and what's happening now, and that, there's clearly something new, and it's clearly, in terms of planetary history, the result of one species with new capabilities that's come along and is doing something. And when this story is written, if anybody is around to write it or discover it in 100 million years, they'll say, oh, look what happened. This species came along, started doing this. And so I think the species narrative is very important, but I don't think that it's an either or. I think we have to keep it in our head at the same time as we keep in our head the knowledge of all the complex local situations and all these questions of environmental justice. I've heard that the mark of a mature mind is being able to hold two seemingly contradictory concepts in your mind at the same time. And I think this is one of those cases. We need the global species view of our story, and we need an awareness of all the messy, particular local details. And I'll just stop with one metaphor, which is that if you're in a boat with a bunch of people and you realize you're in trouble because maybe you're getting too close to some rocks that are going to sink that boat, you might realize, well, there's some people in this boat that didn't really get us here, and there's other people that are really responsible for this, and those people are stronger rowers, and but nobody should sit that out. Everybody should start rowing in the direction away from the rocks, even while you're aware of the differential responsibility. And so, one story does not eliminate the other. I think we need all these stories right now.
So I'll just say I agree with what the comments from a lot of the panelists, and I also see that there's a lot of questions being jotted down on papers and passed, and I'm really excited to get to the questions. So I'll end there.
I was just going to add that I think this scale perspective keeps coming up in our conversations, not only temporal scale, the fact that you brought up that it's so difficult as humans for us to even think a year ahead, 10 years ahead, but then to even wrap our heads around centuries, or where we fit into this, long-term history of the Earth or into the future we just can't wrap our heads around it. It's really hard for me to wrap my head around it. And, but also spatial scale. We want to emphasize this global interaction of all of these moving parts, but it's also, again, a lot of us think and act at the local scale. What's impacting us here? What are the things that are right in front of us? What can I feasibly do? So unfortunately, I think that a lot of times when we think at these really large temporal and spatial scales, a lot of us, just as humans, naturally tend to shut down, tend to block it out. We tend to feel helpless. Like, what am I going to do to help this Earth, as one single person? And so I think it's something that in the future, if we're really going to take action items, is how do we start to bridge those scales together, take something that's so big like climate change and or something that, talking about other planets, and put it in a format that is easily framed into something that we can all do something with, and also not feel too disconnected from. So that's just something I think was an interesting part that everyone's kind of brought up.
Yeah, and that's typically the kind of things where diplomats come in, because we never talk about, the Earth as one species where we are working. We look very much from a nation's perspective. We do that already for 350 years, I think, since Peace of Westphalia in 1648. And we still work with that concept. We still, that's one of the problems we're facing. We work with tools and structures that we created after the last time we tried to destroy our planet, which was the Second World War, and the UN and that system is the follow-up of the time we tried it before in the First World War and the League of Nations. So we're now, whether we like it or not, that's the way that we try to deal with our planet. And I think just 2 years ago we had a very good year in 2015, where you had all over the world all kinds of conferences about these huge global issues. And the two most important ones you've probably heard of, the Paris Agreement on climate change in late 2015. And just before that, all the countries in the world had also agreed on the Agenda 2030. It's a list of 17 sustainable development goals, 17 global goals that all the countries in the world agreed on. If we can, for the next 15 years, focus on these 17 goals, it will really be a lot better in the world with development, with environment, with peace and security, etc. Climate is one of them, so the Paris Agreement is kind of part of that chapter. Many businesses and many governments and many individuals are really working on these goals, on water, food, energy, all kinds of issues. But something you need is commitment of all governments in the world on really trying to make a better world, and that we all are going to do it together. And what you often see now is in many countries all over the world that the people and governments have a feeling like this is getting too much, this is so difficult, let's just isolate ourselves, let's just build a wall, let the other people take care of themselves. You see that in many countries, and I see some laughing here. I wasn't even talking about your government here. I wouldn't dare to. But I mean, things like Brexit, we want our country back. We want to go back to some kind of undefined past when things were better. Or Marine Le Pen in France saying France is no longer safe, as if everything was so much safer in the past. So it's, and that often goes together with a reluctance of really having a global approach where you have to share this whole world together. And that means that the kind of welfare, the kind of, not so much the welfare, the kind of consumption and waste that is taking place in the Western world is absolutely unsustainable for the whole planet, and it's absolutely unfair to the people on the other side of this planet. Let me stop there because these are just introductory comments.
Fantastic. So there's been a lot of questions coming in about this issue of the problems that we're talking about are very long scale, very long term, and what are the barriers to addressing the longer scale? And it would be great to have some of you comment on that very specifically. I think some of us in the U.S. are feeling the barriers in some very specific ways, but globally they're different. And I will close the question with one specific question that came forward is, would it help to think about our grandchildren's grandchildren? I don't know which one of you wants to start.
Maybe I'll take a stab at it to say that, I think that there are a lot of barriers on the longer scale, and but maybe I'll just reframe it for a second to look at what are the opportunities to be connecting the longer scale with the shorter scale. And I think one the question posed was to think about our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren. I mean, those of us who are parents are doing a lot giving up a lot to make a better future for the next generation. And I think if you think of that in an amplified way, that's a really good narrative. But, you know, for those of you who are economists or have taken economics classes, this idea of thinking about the future also comes back to bite discussions about climate, because there's this idea of depreciation and this idea that most people would rather have $100 today than $80 next year. And if you start to think about the idea that today is valued more than the future, then that grandchildren's grandchildren narrative starts to bump into the way that economists think about these things. And I'm not an economist by training, but there's a lot of economists working in policy, and it's been one of the barriers to linking these scales. But to me, one of the narratives that has the most legs is when you start to think about, well, what are the short-term benefits of things that have a long-term payback? And I think when we start to think about it that way, you know, thinking about transportation, let's just say, you know, a lot of us have a car, maybe we like our car, we like the freedom that our car gives us, but what we really like is the freedom and maybe the time. And for those of us who have to spend time, my sister, she's a teacher in Los Angeles, and she drives 45 minutes each way to work. And she has to leave her house before 7 a.m. to make the traffic to get to her school. And you know, and this is not an hour and a half of pleasure in her day, you know? And so I think this idea of, are there ways to, you know, make yesterday's keynote was talking about automated transportation, about the time that would give us back, as well as the environmental benefits. For those of us where telecommuting is a possibility, telecommuting also removes the need for transportation. And I think that there's a lot of these situations where having, you know, a city where you can walk to the grocery store and walk to the restaurant and walk to your work, that's actually a much nicer lifestyle for many people than having to drive all over town and drive from one suburb to another. So to me, the greatest opportunities to be tackling these long-term issues is actually to frame the solutions as short-term wins, and to be doubling down on the win-win opportunities. That's the title of one of tomorrow's panels. But to find the things where even if you don't want to invest in the grandchildren's grandchildren, even if the economic depreciation doesn't make sense, that it still makes sense to take these actions because of the benefits to lifestyle, to savings accounts, to other air pollutants with direct effects, that all of these benefits make it a logical choice in the short term.
Can I add to that? Sure. Okay. So for me, all of these issues really come down to being transboundary. As humans, we like to put nice little lines around things and say, you work on this and I'll work on this, and this is our political boundaries. But our world doesn't actually function and work like that, as we all know. And so for me, a large part of my work does focus on how do we actually get people and different stakeholders at various scales to collaborate to address these really big transboundary issues, whether it's crossing state borders or crossing country borders or looking at something that is a global issue. And it's really difficult. And there's a lot of barriers, unfortunately, in place for collaborative governance to work on the ground. So I helped facilitate a workshop that was on international transboundary management for conservation-specific projects. And one of the things that came up over and over, whether it was groups working in Africa or the Middle East or even in the U.S., was it comes down to relationships. It's relationships, and that takes time. It's people getting together, having contact, understanding where others are coming from, and then being able to work past barriers. So it's actually, you can have all the technical expertise in place, but if you don't have the relationships and the people that can stick with a project long term and sustain those relationships over time, they fall apart. Or they end up taking 10 steps back and then having to start again. And so I think that's something when we're thinking long term that we really need to break down some of those barriers for people just to work with each other and to communicate. I think technology has helped us a lot in those ways, but I think it doesn't replace face-to-face contact. And I think it's really powerful when you have that foundation in place, which does take time, that it can be a huge success to leading to on-the-ground successes and those small wins that lead to bigger wins. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I love this question. I think it's you've gotten at the core of really one of the essential issues here of how we deal with this, the situation we're on this planet. And it's interesting, you know, it's not just a scientific or managerial or diplomatic question. I would actually say, in a certain sense, it's kind of a spiritual question. And that may sound like a strange thing for a scientist to be saying, especially an atheist scientist like myself. And yet I mean that in the sense that it gets to, it's a question of, you know, there are practical aspects of this, but it's also a question of how we identify, how we see ourselves. Are we just these individuals that are here for a few decades and then that's it? Or are we part of this continuity of human life that has been here for generations and continues over generations, and part of this biosphere that has gone through all these transformations and is now challenged through a new transformation? And I think, you know, we do need to think about win-wins and short-term, you know, tricking people into acting in their long-term interest in a certain sense. And I agree with all that tactically. But ultimately, we're also talking about a transformation in the way we think of ourselves that we're going to need to survive. And that seems pretty daunting, but I think if you think of the long-term history of our species, you realize that we have been through similar, and I think, transitions that are as great. You know, we were once hunter-gatherers who would never have thought of ourselves living in cities. And, you know, we've gone through some radical reinventions as a species. And I think ultimately we're talking about a reinvention to deal with the knowledge of what we've become. And also, just quickly, you mentioned technology as a way to bridge these barriers. And I think that's a really important and valid thought. But there's also this paradoxical moment we're at where these darn devices and this darn connectivity is playing such a sort of Janus dual role. We're so distracted by short-term shiny objects and short-term, you know, just everything. You know, The Bachelor. No, sorry, that one's really cool. You know, and you can be thinking ahead to the next season, so there's a long-term aspect of it. No, but you know, but at the same, so these things hinder us, but they also powerfully enable us. We each now have access to so much more knowledge about our long-term history, and we're doing these computer models, we're modeling our future. We have access to ideas about the past and the future, and the knowledge of, you know, at our fingertips. There's so much a knowledge of really what we need to survive. So, you know, what the long-term effect of all this technology on this dynamic is unwritten, and, you know, that's very unsettling, but there are very positive ways that it can help us to connect and to utilize all that information in ways that are, you know, we're just talking about enlightened self-interest here in that transformation. We don't even have to be utopian about it. If we see ourselves the way we really are, then we would act in this long-term way out of our own self-preservation. So I see this transformation happening towards global and long-term thinking. It's just painfully slow, and the question is, you know, are we going to have enough of it on a short enough time scale to avoid a lot of pain?
Great.
Talking about your iPhone, I recently read that an iPhone 6, this is one, has 120,000 times the capacity that the computer had that sent in 1969 the first people to the moon of the Apollo program. Okay, I'll speak louder. I'll talk to you later about my iPhone, because I was not supposed to talk about iPhones here, but I reacted to your talk. We have good examples of our capacity, what we can change. I mentioned the 100,000th part of the history of our planet. If you, and that's when we walk to Australia, if you would cut that in another 1,000 parts, you're just 46 years back. I looked it up for you. That's why iPhones are so handy. On the 10th of April 1972, Richard Nixon and the Prime Minister of the Soviet Union and leaders from another 80 countries signed the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. Mm-hmm. We agreed, all of us, on this planet, all countries, that we would not weaponize things like anthrax or smallpox to wipe each other out. We did not agree on how to check each other on it, but that's another story. But that is, so that happened on 1,000th piece of 100,000th of the history of our planet. I like these kind of numbers normally. On positive examples, when you were talking about cities design, there's a very interesting project led by ex-president of Mexico, Calderon, a couple of years ago, which called the New Climate Economy. It's a very interesting report. You can Google it. It's all public. And they looked at how can we change our economy into something that is much more sustainable and still profitable and usable. One of the things they looked at is city design. And they said that in the next 30 years, worldwide, $90 trillion will be invested in new cities. And as you know, with cities, the pattern stays the same, certainly in Europe where I come from. You know, the street pattern, etc., as in old cities, still the same as the Middle Ages. So there's only one time that you can get it right. And then they give a comparison between two cities, Atlanta and Barcelona. They have the same population. Atlanta is extremely spread out. If you need to buy some toothpaste, you have to get in your car to get it. And Barcelona is so pretty and well organized with good public transport. Go there if you've never been there. And in Barcelona, you don't need to do that. You have work and recreation and shopping and living. You have that all well integrated in a very compact city. If we take those kind of measures from now on, that is at least a very good step towards sustainability. Last remark, to come back to your original question, my daughter is 15 and she's supposed to live until the end of this century when my wife and I are long gone. And by that time, she will have children and grandchildren. And I sometimes can't sleep of the future that she and her children and grandchildren are awaiting. It is so important to really get things right, to be prepared to give up some of our fantastic life that we are living so that we make room on this planet for the ones that are now stepping up into the world middle class. And that is rapidly happening in just between 2009 and 2030. And so in just 21 years, the number of people in the world middle class, people that live like us, that put on the heating or the air conditioning and that drive a car and that sometimes might even fly, is growing roughly from something from a bit more than 2 billion to nearly 5 billion. So it's more than doubling in that time. We have to make room for these people, and we have to coordinate, and we have to be creative, and we have to think globally. And we need solidarity for this, and we need to reduce the absurd inequality that we have on this planet, where I think 78 people have the same wealth on this whole planet as the lowest 50%, that's 3.8 billion people. So we all have to work on that. And everybody can do their own bit. And it starts with little things like the famous shorter showers where everybody talks about, but it's also about voting for the right people. Make use of the power you have in democracy to get the right people in the right place to take the right decisions for this whole planet and not just for your own self on a short time frame. And think about your children and grandchildren. Back to you.
I want to move, going with the long-scale solutions, and this question was posed specifically to you, David, but I think the whole panel could touch upon it, and it was, should we be looking to colonize a new planet, fix the one we have now, or both? And the question was posed as a should, but you certainly could explore the could in thinking very long-term. And I feel very grounded in this planet, like most of you do, but I've been teaching environmental governance to undergraduates this semester, and I'm actually always surprised by the amount of times that some of the students say, well, can't we just go somewhere else? So.
Yeah. Great question. As a lifelong space case, I have thought very much about the possibility that it is human destiny to go live elsewhere in the universe. I believe it quite possibly is on some time scale. And one of the reasons why it's valuable to think about that is because of what we've just been talking about, that it's important to think of the long-term trajectory of our species, not just what's happening right now, but where do we want to go? What vision do we have for ourselves for the future? Having said that, there are people that talk about going to live on Mars as some kind of escape from the problems we're having on Earth, or as a backup planet in case we screw up this one. And that's just dumb. You know, it's really irresponsible, and it defies it's quantitatively, if you think of the number of people being born on this planet and the increase in our population, and if you wanted to solve that problem by sending them to Mars, you know how many people you'd have to launch every day? Even if you somehow thought that was a good idea, it doesn't make any sense. So I'm very much an advocate of exploring space for what we can learn. We've learned so much about how planets work, and that helps us become smarter about managing this planet. I am an advocate of thinking on a certain time scale about humans going to live elsewhere. It's sort of what we do. We left Africa. We, for better or worse, we populated all the continents on this planet. We're an exploring, inquisitive species. We have the ability to remake environments and live in places that formerly seemed completely uninhabitable, like Las Vegas. And so ultimately, I think we will do that with Mars and Venus and other places, but it's not a short-term fix. It's valuable to think about how we would live on Mars, because it makes us think about what do we really need to live on a planet. I think it won't be as easy to live on Mars as Elon Musk thinks it will be, because we'll realize that we get more from this planet than, when they tried doing Biosphere 2 and sealing themselves off for a year, it didn't work, because we realized we have a lot to learn about how we interact with the planet. So I think as a thought experiment, it's a good thing to think about how we would live elsewhere, and I think ultimately it is in our destiny to do that. I don't like the word colonize. I think we will settle other places, because colonization has a bad taste for historical reasons. But it's a valuable thing to think about, but we won't ever be able to do it without figuring out how to live well on a planet, and this is the place we have to do that.
Any other comments or thoughts? No. So another question, and this is to Alexander in particular, but I think, again, anyone could comment to it, but you mentioned all the things we can do as an individual to help change, that we can vote the right people into power, but how do we actually get the attention of policymakers, and how do we get them to bring about change?
Well, voting is one way to get the right policy people in place. But I remember a couple of years ago, I was at Yale for a while in New Haven, and then I used the opportunity to join the protest march in Manhattan in what was that, September 2014. I think that's amazing to see so many, what was it, hundreds of thousands of people united in showing their voice on what you can do. But there's so much more what you can think of. You can unite with a group of people and take certain initiatives that are whatever. Take the compound where you're living, get together and all collectively move to solar panels. You earn it back in whatever, probably here much faster than in my cloudy Netherlands where I come from, where we earned it back in already 7 years. So take initiatives on sustainability, on a better living. Getting the attention at top level, I think, it needs all of us. You don't only have to focus on governments. You could also think about what businesses are doing. There's nowadays so many businesses that are really trying to move to a new business model. I mean, the first one I'm thinking of when I'm speaking here is a multinational like Unilever, where they managed to become much more sustainable, and time again they prove that they actually have a good business case there as well. You might say it's the low-hanging fruit, but still a lot of businesses are not yet doing that. But if you, let's say, you want to reduce the packaging material, which is often too much. When you come home, how much carton and plastic do you have to throw away? If you use just less of that, and there are so many reasons to use less, you use less resources of this planet. You use less energy to make it into packaging material. You have less transportation to bring it to your factory, so you can use a smaller truck and you use less petrol. Then it takes you less time to package it because you have less, and at the end of the day you have less waste. It's not only better for the environment that will be grateful for you for doing that, but it's also better for the company itself. And these kind of win-win situations, there are so many of them. By just moving into a new kind of economy, where, for instance, when I was at Schiphol Airport just 2 or 3 days ago, when I was taking off for going here, in the new lounge there, what Schiphol Airport has done with Philips, the famous light bulb and electronics maker in the Netherlands, is a completely new kind of model to have light in those lounges. So it's no longer the case that Schiphol Airport buys light bulbs and put them in there, and that Philips is is delivering the product light bulbs. But Philips is nowadays delivering the service instead of a product, the service light. So there's a contract that Philips will provide the service that there will be light. And how does that work? Philips puts in the newest LED lights that they have produced that are already 100% more efficient than the previous types that they had. So you have already gained half of the energy, so less pollution, less greenhouse gases, less higher energy bill that you need. And they take care of all of that. For Schiphol Airport, they don't have to do the upfront investment in new light bulbs and are then responsible for it. They just pay the bill for the service that is delivered. It's better for Schiphol, it's better for Philips, and it's much better for the environment. So these kind of new creative circular economy kind of events. Anybody in the company where you're working, in the government offices where you're working, you can think about these kind of new creative ways of saving our planet. Can I stop there?
Go ahead,
I'll just add 2 points that, from my perspective, that we can help with this. One, as a researcher, I know working in an academic institution, a lot of times we're very focused on getting our research into peer-reviewed publications. Well, that information, none of you may have access to. The general public doesn't have, it may get read by a small other group of academics. And so largely a lot of the research and information that we're doing isn't accessible or isn't in a digestible form for not only the public but also decision makers. So that's one thing that I think as researchers, academics, that's something that we can work on to play a more active role into getting our data to more informed decisions at the political level. And there actually is an outlet called The Conversation. I don't know if people have heard of that, but it's a way to actually digest a really complicated, study and make it into a usable form that they can be picked up and be accessible to all of you and to other outlets. So there are steps being taken to hopefully reduce some of those barriers. The other thing I just wanted to mention is thinking about who's not in the room today. All of you are in the room because you somewhat care about this topic. You're engaged in the community and in probably decision making. But thinking about who's not here is a big part of what we need to focus our efforts on. Who is not being represented in a lot of decisions? Who's not able to come to the table? And I think that's something that we are all responsible of too, is thinking that way, and also thinking about people that maybe have opposition to how we think, giving them a chance, understanding those perspectives, because if we don't strategically look at that into the future, we're just going to keep hitting roadblocks. So I just empower us all to think about those things too.
Yeah, and one additional sort of, the question was, how can we get the attention of leaders? And in general, you're going to get the attention of leaders in your community much more quickly than in Washington or Brussels. And I think that that it's really important to recognize, one theme that's come up in this panel has been communities, cities, Barcelona versus Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And when we're talking in this global perspective, a city is actually really small. Something like 2% of the land of the planet is covered with cities. That's not much. However, on a global basis, about 50% or more than 50% of the population lives in cities. And in the United States, over 80% of the population lives in cities. So if cities can take the lead and communities can take the lead in making change, then that's something that really has the potential to have a global impact. It's really where the local meets the global.
Did you have anything? No? Okay. I just want to thank you all for coming here. Thank you for your questions, and hopefully you've realized that the Earth is in all human hands, it seems like. So thank you very much. That was great. That was really fun.
Yeah, that was fun. Great job.
So fun. No, it was so fun hearing
It was. Good perspective. I loved
It was awesome.
It.
Yeah.
Good conversation. I'm like, man, let's do this for another. Let's
keep going.
We should do this conversation.
Go on the road. We got some
I know. But like,
Make a road trip.
I learned from everything there. So
I'd like to see some of the
their
other
ideas
questions
were
that
also.
I know.
I know we didn't.